Hello, everyone. Welcome you to the Asian American Scholar Forum webinar. And this is the first one in 2023. My name is Xiaodong Zhang, a member of the AASF. I'm also a professor of computer science and engineering at the Ohio State University. As we know, the Fourth Amendment of the US Constitution protects us from random and arbitrary stops and searches by law enforcement officers. However, the US Customs and Border Protection, CBS, has set certain rules in the border to make warrantless stops for the purpose of national security. We need to know these rules and how to respond those stops to protect our own rights. Our webinar today invites experts in surveillance, national security, criminal and immigration law to discuss and have a dialogue on the topic of knowing your rights. I'm very pleased to introduce the moderator of the webinar today, Gisela Kusakawa, who is also the founding executive director of AASF. Gisela herself is a legal expert and attorney on civil rights. She received her Juris Doctor degree from George Washington University Law School. She is also a board member of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association Education Fund and holds several other leadership positions. Gisela, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Xiaodong Zhang, our chair for our webinar planning committee here at AASF. Certainly, we would not be able to have opportunities to educate and empower you all today without his public service, the work of so many of our board leadership, membership, and staff, and most of all, those of you who shared your stories and flagged this as an issue that we need to address. Asian American Scholar Forum decided to host today's webinar after hearing about multiple incidents of Chinese Americans and their families being stopped at ports of entry where they were subjected to interrogation. Many within the community raised concerns about the role of racial bias, differential treatment, and profiling. We felt here at AASF that it is important that our community knows their rights and that we help you all feel a little bit more empowered with the knowledge that you need should you find yourself in a difficult situation. Many of our questions today and the issues we covered are based on the questions that you all submitted. Please note that you can continue to submit questions throughout the webinar. Our Associate Director of Strategic Communications, Mary Tablante, will be logging your questions in. With that, I would like to first introduce Brian Sun, partner at Norton Rose Fullbright. He has been a civil rights icon within the legal community, representing Wenho Lee, one of the most prominent cases of a Chinese American being targeted, to many scientists, researchers, and scholars today who continue to be subjected to heightened scrutiny. We also have Greg Chen, the Senior Director of Government Relations at the American Immigration Lawyers Association. He has been at the forefront of many of the immigration issues that impact all of us, including access to counsel, and the main topic of discussion today in terms of how you may be treated at the border or ports of entry. Lastly, but not least, we have Ashley Gorski, who will be starting off our discussion today. Ashley is the senior staff attorney at ACLU's National Security Project. It has been such a pleasure to work with her on many of these cases. She has been a staunch advocate and defender of justice with a deep understanding of the ways that profiling and racial bias has impacted Asian American and immigrant scholars across the country. ACLU has created a resource on today's discussion, which is enforcement at ports of entry, specifically at airports. So Ashley, just to kick us off, can you walk us through what does airport enforcement look like? What can people expect? And in this modern day and age, how should we be thinking about our electronics when it comes to travel? And can our electronics be searched at the border?
And thank you so much, Gisela, for the opportunity to be here tonight, and thank you to AASF. Just the normal disclaimers at the outset, this is not legal advice or a substitute for it, but I'm providing an overview of the legal rules at the border and hope that you all find it helpful. I will be focused tonight on the rights of US citizens. Greg Chen, who's speaking right after me, will talk about the rights of lawful permanent residents, non-citizen visa holders, and visitors. And big picture, the rights of US citizens and lawful permanent residents are very similar, but merit separate discussion. My presentation tonight will focus first on questioning by border officials and then physical searches with a focus specifically on searches of electronic devices. And if you're watching or listening in tonight, you are presumably familiar with the typical entry process at the US border. When you first arrive at an airport or a land port of entry, you go through an initial inspection booth known as primary inspection. And there, Customs and Border Protection, CBP, will seek to verify your identity and will likely ask you about the nature and purpose of your travel. If you are a US citizen, you technically only have to answer questions establishing your identity and your citizenship. Once CBP knows who you are and that you're a citizen, you have the right to enter the country. However, if you refuse to answer the basic questions at primary inspection about the nature and purpose of your travel, it is extremely likely to result in delay and further inspection. And for most people, thinking about the trade-offs at this stage, it tends to make sense to answer those basic questions, even though you have the right to refuse to. And so even after those basic questions, you may still be pulled aside for further questioning in a separate area or closed room. This is called secondary inspection. And if you're pulled into secondary inspection, it does not necessarily mean that you're suspected of wrongdoing. And that's because CBP has extremely broad latitude to select people for additional inspection. Officers cannot pull you aside based on race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin, but this rule is difficult to enforce in practice. So if you're selected for secondary inspection, it could be that an officer just made a decision on the spot to send you there. And it could be that the FBI has flagged your name. CBP provides the FBI with lists of people who are scheduled to arrive in the country from abroad, about 72 hours in advance. And the FBI will sometimes flag names for CBP to question further. And the FBI does this for a number of reasons, including to cultivate informants. So it may not be that the FBI is targeting a particular individual for investigation, but that the FBI thinks someone who meets this demographic profile could potentially be a useful informant. So as a US citizen, once you're in secondary inspection, what are your rights? And here your legal status in the US matters tremendously. As a citizen, you have the right to enter the United States. So if the officer's questions in secondary inspection become intrusive or uncomfortable, you can decline to answer those questions. However, again, if you decline, it can result in delay and further inspection. Another thing to know, if you have health conditions that require access to medication, you should let CBP know as soon as you're pulled into secondary inspection. CBP must also provide you with access to food and water when necessary and permit bathroom access accompanied by a CBP escort. And if the officer's questions become, again, uncomfortable, too intrusive, you can complain. You can ask to speak to a supervisor. If the officer is not courteous or respectful, take note of their name and their badge number in case you wish to report it afterward. Although CBP takes the position that you are not entitled to an attorney during primary and secondary inspection, I'd still encourage you to have the phone number of an attorney or a legal services organization with you and to contact them, or CBP to contact them, if you feel that your rights are being violated or if you've been detained for an unusually long period. In my experience, by the 2-hour mark, sometimes CBP will let people make a call. It's worth trying to make a call, even if CBP tells you you aren't entitled to speak to an attorney. And if you are represented by an attorney beforehand, it can be helpful to show CBP a letter or other documentation concerning the representation. It can also be helpful to coordinate with the attorney in advance, like message the attorney as soon as you get off the plane, let them know you're going to secondary. The attorney can make a call to CBP to let CBP know that someone is watching. Again, those calls don't usually result in any real attorney-client exchange, but it can help to shorten the duration and the intensity of the secondary questioning. And if you do answer an officer's questions, you obviously have to tell the truth. lying to a federal law enforcement officer is a very serious crime. And then if a customs officer informs you that you are under arrest, or if another border agent informs you that you are under arrest, or if it becomes clear that the person asking you questions suspects that you have committed a crime, you should ask to speak to a lawyer before answering any further questions. And if you wish to exercise your right to remain silent, you should say so out loud. And then finally, on questioning, we often get questions about whether people can be interrogated about their religious beliefs or practices or their political opinions. And the answer is no. These are protected by the First Amendment. However, CBP officers have often asked travelers about their religious affiliation, religious practices, associations with religious institutions, their political views. And I'm currently representing 3 Muslim Americans who are routinely asked these kinds of intrusive and inappropriate questions when they come back to the US from international travel. So it's an issue we're litigating. Unfortunately, it happens far more than it should because it patently presents a serious violation of the First Amendment. So again, moving on now to searches. We've been talking a lot about questioning, but there's also the search component. So with secondary inspection, you are typically or often subject to a physical search of your luggage. CBP does not need a warrant to do that, and it does not even need suspicion of wrongdoing. And just to provide a little more background on the Fourth Amendment framework, I'm sure many of you are familiar with a warrant, but if not, in brief, normally if law enforcement wants to search through your belongings, they need to go to a judge and show probable cause to believe that their search is going to turn up evidence of a crime. Unfortunately, however, that rule does not apply at the border, which gives CBP significant latitude to invade your privacy. And there's been a lot of litigation about how this border search exception to the Fourth Amendment applies to searches of electronic devices, because our phones and our laptops are different in kind from our luggage. For most people, a government search of your phone, your laptop is far more intrusive because our entire lives are stored on these devices. The bottom line, though, is that unfortunately, the courts have said that CBP does not need to suspect you of wrongdoing to manually search your device. For more comprehensive forensic searches of devices, the courts are in conflict about exactly what level of suspicion is required, but they have said that CBP does not need to get a warrant to forensically search your device. So then the natural question is, do I have to give CBP my laptop passwords or unlock my phone at the border? And again, your legal status in the country matters again here. US citizens cannot be denied entry to the United States for refusing to provide a password or refusing to unlock their phone. However, refusal might lead to delay. It can lead to additional questioning, and it can also lead to officers seizing your device for further inspection. And when this happens, it's an open question whether the officers can successfully break into the locked device if the device has a sophisticated, complicated password, but they will make an attempt to. And the other open question is how long it takes to get your device back. Some of our clients will get their device back within a matter of days, but for some, CBP has held their devices for months. So it's critically important that you go into these encounters informed about the potential trade-offs. If you are going to provide your password, it is worth trying to input it yourself rather than telling the CBP officer what the password is, because he or she will then record it and it can be part of your file. And either way, it's a good practice to change your password as soon as you get home from the airport. And one final note on forensic searches: if CBP forensically searches your device, it may maintain a copy of that data for up to 15 years, where it's accessible to thousands of DHS employees. So it's a really intrusive, problematic practice, but just something to be aware of. If border officers confiscate your device, you should ask for a receipt and a contact number for the agency, and you should take down as many details about the officer as possible, like the name and the badge number. And in the event that you have like attorney-client privileged material on your device, you should flag that for CBP as well, because there are certain procedures that they are supposed to follow with respect to that information. So in light of that, it's a pretty grim picture, but there are some steps that you can take affirmatively to protect your privacy and your data. And the first is to travel with as little data and as few devices as possible. The less you're carrying, the less there is for them to search. You should consider using a travel-only smartphone or laptop that does not contain private or sensitive information. You want to encrypt your devices with strong and unique passwords and make sure that they are locked when you're going through customs. Ideally, you would store sensitive data in a cloud storage account. It is CBP policy that agents cannot search cloud stored data from your electronic devices. So they can't go into your device and then try to access through an app whatever you might have in the cloud. But to help ensure that CBP actually complies with that policy, it's important to turn on airplane mode for your electronic devices before going through customs. That will prevent them from trying to access the internet once they're into your device. And then finally, log out of social media and email accounts before going through customs. So those are our recommendations, and look forward to answering your questions at the end. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And I'm sure folks will have more questions to dig into the electronic device searches. I'll now turn to Greg, our immigration law expert. If you can share some additional insights on how people can better prepare. Also, we know that we may not all be treated the same at the border. What rights do folks have arriving at the US border or ports of entry like the airport? And what are the differences in treatment based on one's immigration status?
Thank you, Gisela. It's very good to be with all of you, and thank you to the Asian American Scholars Forum for organizing this important panel. So I'll start with that first question Gisela mentioned, and that's a good segue from what Ashley was describing. The basic principle to recognize is that everybody who comes to the US border or port of entry has basic rights, but your level of rights is going to depend upon what your immigration status is. Ashley already went over basically the highest level of rights that you'd have, which is for US citizens. So I'm going to go into the next stage, which is what if you are somebody who has a green card, a lawful permanent resident, or an LPR, as we often refer to them just by the acronym. And so you still have significant rights, but it's going to be a little bit different, a little bit less in a sense than what US citizens would have. And before I get into those details, one concept I just want to clarify here is that the main purpose when you come in at a port of entry or border checkpoint for the officers to be screening for is are you in a valid immigration status to be able to come into the country? And if you're a US citizen, you're at the highest level. And the second question is going to be, are you posing a safety threat or a criminal danger to people in the country? And those are generally the frameworks that somebody as an officer is going to be evaluating you when you come in. So I'm going to be focusing on that first set of evaluations in terms of what is your immigration status. The lawful permanent resident question, first of all, they're going to be asking you questions, no matter what your status is, US citizen or lawful resident, to assess if you're in that valid status. And the first question they want to establish is, are you in compliance with the conditions of being a lawful permanent resident? There are typically residence requirements for that. And they're going to want to, as an officer, evaluate, have you been out of the country for a brief period of time, because lawful permanent residents are not typically going to be out of the country for more than a period of 6 months. So that brief assessment, they may ask you questions about how long were you abroad? They're going to check your stamps and when you left the United States. The other question is kind of evaluation of what they refer to as innocent. Was your time out of the country brief and innocent? Innocent is just kind of a label for whether or not there were any concerns about illegal activity that may have happened while you were out of the country, or something that might have happened when you're still in the United States. Because even if you have a green card, you can lose that green card status if you commit certain kinds of behaviors, including criminal activity that's you have convictions for, in or out of the United States. At any point, if CBP determines that you may be in violation of your green card status, they might determine that you are considered an arriving alien. And that is simply that they've concluded from their viewpoint, this doesn't mean that they've made the decision that is final, but they have determined that you are no longer in compliance with your green card status. You can then ask for a hearing. You have a right to a hearing before the immigration judge. So all of the kinds of advisals that Ashley was recommending are ones that you want to think about in terms of answering questions, because what you tell the CBP is not the final word. You have the opportunity to come before an immigration judge. Now, those kinds of proceedings will take more time. And again, choosing not to answer questions may delay you immediately at the border port of entry. The second analysis that comes in terms, the third layer is if you are not a US citizen and not somebody with a green card, you may be an immigrant coming in with a visa. That could be a non-immigrant visa status, meaning on a temporary basis, or somebody who has a visitor visa that's for only a very short period of time. Now, many of the folks I imagine on this call are people that may be coming in as scholars, as students on J1 or F1 type visas. And this is the category of entrants who have a visa to come in, but you are essentially at the lowest level of tier in terms of protection, even though you do have rights and protection. So CBP, the Customs and Border Protection, may deny you entry if they decide that you are not in compliance with your visa status or you've violated your visa requirements. What they are basically looking at is, what kind of a visa are you here for? And oftentimes, if you're here not for a permanent basis, they may think that you are here to stay permanently and ask you questions to evaluate that. So what's important here is to recognize that if you are deemed to be inadmissible by Customs and Border Protection, the officer, and that's a term of art, inadmissibility, they may offer, you're then kind of in a difficult posture because you have less rights at that point as somebody who is a non-immigrant or somebody who does not have a green card status. And you actually could be placed into something called expedited removal, which is essentially it's a faster proceeding, and you don't have a right to an immigration judge hearing if you get put into expedited removal proceedings. One thing you can do, and this is a tricky decision, is you may decide to withdraw your request to be admitted into the country. The benefit of doing this is that you are then not going to have a more severe consequence placed on you if you try to come back in the future. If they subject you to expedited removal and decide that you are going to be removed, then you will have a possible 5-year bar to being able to re-enter the country, which is very severe. If you decide, okay, I'm going to withdraw my request, I'd like to do that, you can inform them, and then you can leave the country and try to figure out a way to come back in. I recognize that's a very difficult posture to be in if you are in that situation. Usually that's going to come up when you're placed into what Ashley described before as a secondary inspection situation, where they'll have asked you questions about about what your intentions are. And at this point, that's when you really want to be able to seek legal advice before making those decisions. What are some of the reasons that they might determine that you should not be admitted if you are here on an immigrant visa? Well, it could be that they suspect that you are committing fraud. They think that there's something inaccurate about why you are coming or information that you've supplied to them about your visa. It could be, again, any kind of illegal activity that they suspect you have committed. And again, it could be that they think you are not going to be complying with your visa status when you come in. The most obvious is they think you're going to actually stay here permanently rather than for a shorter period that your visa may be valid for. The final category that I'll just mention here briefly is if they're going to determine that you're going to be forced to leave the country, if you fear that return to your home country, you're going to be subjected to persecution of some kind. If you express that fear to Customs and Border Protection, the officer, you have a right to seek asylum, and that would put you into the opportunity to request that asylum and eventually the opportunity to come before a judge to receive a review of that asylum claim. So that's something to bear in mind if going back to your home country is something that would place you at danger or at risk. Now, having gone through those categories, I'm going to jump quickly to just some steps that you might want to consider before you travel, and then what you should do at that moment if you're coming in. And I'll try not to overlap too much with what Ashley mentioned before. So first of all, I think that if you are concerned that you might be at risk when you're coming in for whatever reason it could be, I know many people in this call, being of Asian background, you may have concerns that there are going to be perceived bias or discriminatory reasons why you might be targeted for more stricter scrutiny when you come into the country. So either way, if you feel like you might be vulnerable, what I would suggest you do is to consult with an attorney, or at least to obtain a recommendation for an attorney whose phone number and email information you can have, and even reach out to that attorney to build a relationship. It doesn't mean that you have to incur substantial cost per se, but that if you are in that posture when you're returning to the country, or if you have questions when you're out of the country, if something happens, you could consult with that attorney and not worry about scrambling to find somebody when you're out of the country, which could be very difficult. If you need recommendations, I can certainly provide that. Our website, AILA, that's ailalawyer.org, is a resource that you can use to identify an attorney in advance. And so that's the most important, I think, first step that you can do. I would also think about the steps that Ashley mentioned regarding technology before you leave the country and travel. Now, what do you do if you are stopped? Ashley already went through many of these categories. I will walk through them very quickly. The important thing to remember is there are going to be protected categories, as Ashley mentioned, that CBP is not allowed to base decisions about entries, such as race, national origin, religion, political beliefs, etc. They may, however, ask you questions to determine if you're within immigration, the valid status, and that could include questions about what countries you travel to. And so you may feel like they are probing into your background and national origin, but CBP it has a valid basis to ask where you travel to determine the reasons for your travel in and out of the country. And so those are going to be some gray zone areas that might make you uncomfortable, but it's important to try to understand where they are coming from. The other things that I'll just flag here is you have a right to request assistance from a lawyer, but you don't necessarily have the right, at least it's not clear in law yet, to have an attorney represent you during a secondary inspection process. You should be able to request a phone call, and if they're not willing to give you a phone call, you should be asking to speak with a supervisor. You should be asking for an interpreter if you don't understand what they are saying to you. The same thing if you're given documents, you should be able to get those documents in a language that you can understand, and you should never be signing anything without understanding what that is and having it in a language that you can understand. The final thing that I'll mention is some things that you could consider doing if something very bad or you feel harassed, if that happens in the interview context. Immediately after, write down what happened. If it's right after departing from the airport, or if you're in transit, you're on the airplane still and something terrible happened, had a bad interaction, you felt like you got harassed, write it down so that you have as close to like a contemporaneous record of your recollection of what the officer said and what the name, any badge number you have of the officer. Finally, after you maybe return home, you can also make a report to the Department of Homeland Security. They have a redress request form, and I'll put that or I'll send it to Gisela so she can distribute it. But that's a way to lodge a complaint about what happened. Now, you may feel like, oh, something terrible happened. Why is it worth it for you to do this? They will respond to that, and it's good for accountability purposes to provide that information, especially if there are discriminatory animuses involved. I will stop there and happy to take any questions that may come.
Thank you so much, Greg. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is what Greg mentioned about making sure you have these contacts with an immigration attorney beforehand. You really want to take these extra precautions, especially if you're worried. Now, folks are concerned not just what happens when they enter the country at ports of entry, but also after they leave the airport. I'm turning to Brian, who is our criminal law expert, sharing some of the most common questions that we've received. Brian, based on your own experiences representing Chinese American scientists and researchers who have been stopped at the border, could you respond to whether being stopped at the border means that you're also potentially under criminal investigation? Is there more behind a border stop, or are these stops random? Also, Ashley touched on this a bit, but can you dig deeper on whether the FBI is involved with informing CBP on who to stop? And should people be getting a criminal defense attorney as well? You're on mute, Brian.
Let me see if I can tackle the first inquiry, which is, are these random? Are these something more than that? And not to be conspiracy theorists, but is the FBI behind this and all that kind of thing? Well, some of you who have heard me speak before have heard me talk, of course, about the China initiative, which many of you are aware of. And whereas many people thought about a year ago when the DOJ announced that they're pulling back on the China initiative to the extent that they were not going to criminalize as much the kind of cases they had been towards academics. That does not mean that government scrutiny of academic researchers with ties to China in particular are sort of immune from any kind of government harassment, if you will. That is to say, the government was charging academic researchers pre-2021 or 2022 with a lot of these what I call gotcha cases, where researchers were filling out forms for grant agencies or for the universities, and maybe they forgot to put something down, maybe the question was vague, maybe there was some deliberate misleading of outside interest, whatever, but the government was criminalizing stuff that before that was more of an employment issue with the university, and not criminal. And so by 2022, early 2022, the government announced they were going to stop criminalizing most of those cases unless they met certain criteria where there was actual evidence of proprietary research being unlawfully transferred to China, things like that. They're still looking to criminalize. But the scrutiny of academics did not end last year. What the criminal division and the Justice Department basically said is, look, this is still a threat to national security. We have concerns about PRC efforts to infiltrate and illicitly obtain US technology through academics. But they sort of said, look, the agencies should be enforcing administratively or otherwise, civilly, the rules and regulations that prohibit conflicts of interest and things of that nature. So what you have now is a dynamic that has developed over the last year or so, is where the NSF, the Department of Education, and various government grant agencies are now looking at how the universities conducted themselves during all this. And you have the ultimate irony now where the universities are now under the scrutiny by the government agencies. And we've already seen, and I hate to pick on Professor Zhang over there at Ohio State, but Ohio State got whacked, if I can use that term, by the government for failure to properly supervise, comply with government grant regulations regarding disclosure of conflicts of interest, particularly with China. And I can tell you other universities around the country are similarly feeling the scrutiny of these agencies. And the ultimate irony from the standpoint of professors is some of the very same defenses professors would assert, namely the ambiguity surrounding these weird conflict of interest forms and these gotcha forms, that they're vague, ambiguous, the agencies didn't really say what they were trying to get at. The universities are asserting some of the same defenses that researchers would assert to their employers and to the government. A little bit of irony there. And so now what you have as a consequence, and one reason why we're having this webinar tonight, is that what we have seen is a number of academics who historically have had Chinese research ties, either currently or historically, have been identified, profiled, whatever, largely in connection with administrative or agency inquiries about a certain university. So some of the incidents we have heard about include universities that are under scrutiny for their alleged failure to comply with disclosure obligations, and that some of the university employees, professors, academics involved in some of the programs that the government is scrutinizing that the university may have failed to adequately make disclosures on, those professors are being identified and put into what I call the system. The system being that there is an alert when Professor ABC comes in and out of the country. We are now in a time scenario too, where China is finally relaxing, if you will, their travel restrictions to China. A lot of people haven't been to China in a few years, since pre-pandemic. And now it's opening up. And those of you on this call are attending the seminar who are, whether you're Chinese American or not, but you're an academic with pre-existing or historical ties to Chinese research institutions and the like, you are a likely group of folks that could be put into the system so that when you travel internationally, you could get stopped at the border when you're coming back. Some get stopped going out, but it's more coming back. And we've seen a disturbing number of increase of those kinds of stops where professors or academics, Professor ABC's name has been put in the system by some combined government agency effort, could be the U.S. Attorney's Office with the FBI, with Department of Education or the NSF in particular, where they've given a bunch of names to the government to put into the system so that when you're traveling back into the country, and you might not be traveling back from China, you'll be, one case I know, someone was coming back from Japan. Another case I'm aware of, someone was coming back from Israel. Israel, of course, major threat to U.S. national security. Whatever, it didn't matter. They were stopped and they were asked questions. Now, on some occasions, we have seen that the CBP officer who does this, and this is part of answering your question in my long-winded way, Gisela, it wasn't random. This guy knew a little bit about that professor's connection to a particular issue that was being looked at by the government at a particular university. So it wasn't random, all right? And in some cases, the officer may not be that well informed, but they'll have some information from the agency or agent that put the name in the system, so they know what kind of questions to ask. Oh, you're an academic. What kind of stuff do you do? Blah, blah, blah. Do you do stuff with China, et cetera? And it's a flowing back and forth because the mandate is to ask the traveler basically if what they've been doing abroad, and if they can, find out if they're doing anything in connection with some kind of research that could end up in the hands of the PRC. So now the second prong of your question, Gisela, was what was it? I think Could you
Yeah,
remind?
and if you could essentially clarify for folks whether if they're being stopped at the border means they should also get a criminal defense attorney
Oh,
afterwards.
really? Now, first thing all criminal defense lawyers would say is, of course you should get one. But no, my position has been the same throughout. Try not to be stupid. Try not to be, as Ashley and Greg have said, look, you know, some people travel with burner phones or laptops that don't have stuff on them. And certainly don't bring your work with you unless you have some need to do it and some basis to do it. And you can show that it's stuff you're taking with you that you're authorized to possess. Okay. You know, some people who know they're going to be possibly in the line of fire should and do contact lawyers, to the point where I give you some examples of what I do sometimes. I'm told of the itinerary of the client. I'm told generally when they're going through or when their plane is landing. And I'm waiting for something to pop up here on the phone. And I got one the other day from someone saying, got through, no questioning, you know, that kind of thing. Sometimes though, I'll get the text saying, I've been stopped, I'm going to secondary. Now, going to Ashley and Greg's points, it's not like I can get on the phone easily and sit there during the interrogation. Most CBP agents will not let you do that. But you can let them know you have somebody that you'd like to talk to, or let them know that you're being asked questions about your employment. And you can sort of say, look, this is only because my employer would want to know, as well as my personal lawyer, that I've been stopped to be asked about my employment. And you can give them, you know, the name of the lawyer, contact information, and certainly, as Ashley suggested, get the name and badge number, whatever you can get about the officer who's interviewing you. Because sometimes we can check them out, see where they're based, see if they were specially brought in because they knew in advance you were landing from Beijing or something like that. Okay, they do think this stuff out if they know that someone's coming in, okay? And they'll try to have somebody there to ask questions. Now, why do they do this? Well, because, you know, the border is a great place because your rights are more limited. And they can get access to stuff they couldn't get normally without doing a search warrant, such as access to your devices, access to your WeChats and WhatsApps and all the communications you're having with friends, relatives, associates, and people in China. Now, those of you who are academics, while you may be breathing a sigh of relief, oh, they're not criminalizing this stuff anymore, and we still have the residual cases like Franklin Tao in Kansas, who needs all our support as we fight the end of the criminal part of the China initiative. We need to be cognizant that, you know, either some of the historical research that you've done with China is still under scrutiny. And if they're not going to get you, they're going to get the university, because the overall goal is to stop collaboration with Chinese research institutions. That's the goal of the United States government under their national security policy. All right. And they will play gotcha. They'll play gotcha on the poor researchers, the PhD postdocs who are coming in from China to study at Stanford, Berkeley, Yale, Harvard, wherever, MIT. And they'll try to trip them up on a visa fraud thing at the border. So they can harass the researchers and the talent that we, the United States, want to attract here in the US from China. The government wants to discourage that, all under the guise of national security. All right. So, but as Ashley said, don't lie. When I go through the border and I'm bringing my Cuban cigars, I don't lie. If they ask me if my cigars are Cuban, I tell them they're Cuban. They want to seize them, they can seize them. But don't lie. Don't be stupid, because they'll make something of that later if you lie to a CBP officer. Better you don't answer the question, say, I'd rather talk to my lawyer before I answer that question, and just decline to answer it if it's something really sensitive. Now, those of you who have collaborations, not maybe have decreased or eliminated your collaborations with Chinese research institutions, those of you who have outside consultancy gigs or participating in a joint venture with a private entrepreneur on research or something outside of the university, you got to be careful about that stuff too, because the FBI and the agencies are looking to see how their research could end up in private entrepreneurial endeavors that hasn't been sanctioned by the government. So everyone here needs to be aware that the scrutiny of scholars has not ended. It continues in a different form. And again, you need to be prepared. So having a lawyer or someone you can talk to, if you're stopped, text them. Some CBP officers will let them call you at least to let you know what they're asking and stuff like that. But, you know, if you fit some of the categories that I just described a few moments ago, it would be good to take those precautions, particularly since China is now opening up. And, you know, it would be not unusual for you to go back and visit classmates, people you collaborated in the past, and the government will be all over that if you're doing it, because they'll ask about it. All right, I know that we've got a certain schedule here, so I'm going to stop rambling here and go back to you, Gisela, and have you take over from here.
Thank you so much, Brian, for those insights. I think that has really been top of mind for people in terms of that link on the criminal consequences. I wanted to turn over next to Greg in terms of a question on whether when CBP officers are not conducting themselves appropriately, such as refusing to provide their badge or name, what are some of the avenues for a person to address that on the spot or even afterwards? I know you mentioned specifically border harassment, but how can someone conduct themselves at that moment?
So I think the simple answer here is, you should be requesting information about an officer if you're concerned about the behavior. You can be firm, but always be polite. Never be physically aggressive in any way or physically resistant in any way. You can ask to speak to a supervisor if the officer is still not willing to give you his or her information. But if you can't get through at that point, another stage that you can request is to ask for somebody referred to as the professionalism service manager at the port of entry. That's just another layer of escalation. It's functionally a layer above the supervisor. These are all steps that you can request. Obviously, if the officer refuses, you'd have access to these individuals. You need to make an assessment of whether or not you're going to keep pushing that because it may aggravate the officer and just make things more difficult for you. But try to get as much information you can. Try to remember facts about the situation so that later on, when you're perhaps in a more safe and stable position, wherever you might be, if you've made it into the United States or if you were actually forced back, that you can protect yourself at that point and file a complaint. Maybe, Gisela, if I could answer or just raise a broader issue that I think is important here. That is, first of all, I'm just very glad to see that there are so many participants on your call here. I think those of you who are on this call, and you've had the benefit of hearing from Ashley and Brian, and hopefully I've been able to offer some helpful information, but that's the first step in protecting yourself. Why is it important to try to file complaints and have attorneys protect you? Because it's very possible that there are going to be discriminatory basis for targeting certain individuals. It's very hard to know that on the spot when it happens. It sometimes happens, but that there's going to be a clear animus targeting you for something that's a protected ground, but oftentimes there won't be. But if you contact an attorney or resources like what the Asian American Scholars Forum can provide, or other organizations like the ACLU or ALA, that can help you, help us track and organizations develop protections for the community at large. And that's why I think what AASF is doing here is so valuable. So I just want to make that point. If you're wondering, well, what's the point of reaching out? it not only protects yourself, but it can protect the community more broadly. You can understand the context. The analogy here is what happened during the Muslim ban under President Trump, or even farther back after 9/11, tremendous targeting of many people from many countries, primarily Muslim and also Middle Eastern. And it only took years of advocacy by different organizations before we could remove some of the kinds of discriminatory practices that did become absolutely entrenched in law. And some of the things like China Initiative that Brian and others have talked about here so eloquently are entrenched and institutionalized in law. And until we can fight back and demonstrate that this is wrong, those things will last and make it harder for people in the community.
Thank you so much, Greg. And I want to emphasize Greg's point about how this can go beyond even just your particular situation. I mean, thank you to all those who already shared their stories with AASF, because without that, we wouldn't have even known that we needed to have this Know Your Rights session at the beginning of Lunar New Year, which is a very unfortunate time for everyone to really find themselves at a point where they're being harassed or stopped at the border. I wanted to raise another question. I know, Greg, you touched on this a bit for those who are not United States citizens or not green card holders. But a common question we often hear is international students and how they can prepare themselves beforehand, considering some of the language barriers and also just the distance. For some of the students who are forced to leave the country, how can they actually file some of these complaints from abroad? And what are some of the resources that they could potentially use to help them?
That's a very good question. I think at the most general level, I will just say that people coming in on student visas, I mentioned the F and also the J visas. There are other kinds of non-immigrant visa statuses. You might be here on an H-1B. You're all going to be in a similar situation where, as I mentioned, in terms of the tiers of protection, you have the least amount of essentially rights for when you're trying to return. And so those principles are still going to apply. How you protect yourself, I would refer to the same kinds of comments that Ashley, Brian, and I have made here before. Try to make sure that you think about what you are bringing with you, be it electronic devices or other materials, documents that might be looked through. Try to make sure that you have resources that are ready, such as an attorney, information. If you don't already have a relationship, at least try to get a contact so that you can call somebody, like Brian's cell phone. Everybody should have Brian's cell phone at the end of this call. But I mean that seriously. These are just ways to protect yourself before you go on the trip. And I'm really sorry. And I mean, I think it's a terrible thing that people have to feel like, wow, I might be subjected to greater scrutiny for whatever reason. But that may be the reality. And these are simple steps that you can take to at least try to guard yourself a little bit more. Hopefully you'll never need it. But I would say those are the basic elements. And it won't change too much among the visa status categories for a student compared to, let's say, other non-immigrants.
Thank you, Greg. And the next question is really open for everyone, but perhaps, Ashley, we can dig a little deeper on your expertise on the surveillance side. We touched a bit on, some of the criminal aspects after you leave the airport, but folks also have a question of whether they're being watched afterwards. They're concerned about their emails, phone calls, and any communications being monitored. Is there any way to know whether you're being watched, and what are some of your protections?
Unfortunately, there's not a way to know definitively, and this is just one of the challenges of secret surveillance more generally. So it is really hard to say whether being pulled to secondary inspection means that someone is under surveillance. It's going to depend on the facts of the particular case. And these encounters happen for different reasons, right? So not everyone who's pulled into secondary inspection is suspected of a crime. And it's just very difficult to know what category you're in. And I think part of why it's hard to know is that CBP treats the border as a dragnet for general gathering of intelligence, even though it's not an intelligence agency and its actual legal mandate is to enforce immigration and customs laws. But it's a coercive environment. And I think Brian and Greg both made this point that people may provide more information to the government in that environment than they would if the FBI showed up at their house, and CBP really exploits that. But as a general matter, it's prudent to treat email like skywriting. I read that one several years ago. It's really stuck with me. Regardless of government surveillance, you don't know what could happen. If you put in an email, it can show up later. And in general, we recommend that people who are interested in preserving their privacy use encrypted messaging applications like Signal.
We are a big fan of Signal here. We actually had an interesting question here that I realized we hadn't elaborated on with our panelists, but folks had a question on what's the difference in your rights for departure versus entering the United States. Feel free for anyone who wants to take a shot at it.
I can take a shot at this. I will confess, though, I haven't had this particular situation come up that so direct experience with it. But the basis that you may be asked questions upon departure would again be based on those two principles I mentioned before. One, if there are concerns that come up, something that got flagged about your immigration status, maybe that they think you are here as a student, and then you're leaving and you may be planning to come back, and they have concerns about whether or not you are in compliance with your visa. So they may be asking you questions based on that. The other could be if there's any suspicion regarding a broader range of dangerous or criminal behavior that they might be trying to evaluate you for. So if you get asked and pulled aside for that reason, I think that is more unusual. Scrutiny is usually done when you're trying to return into the United States. But I would use the same kind of protective evaluations or steps that we talked about before if you get pulled into that situation.
Yeah, the stuff I've seen is involving people who are leaving the country and the government thinks they might not be coming back, and they might be taking something with them that maybe they, like a laptop full of information from their employer. So they might stop you for that. So those are those instances. Those are more criminal rather than civil, though you're just going to see more and more of these civil trade secret theft, type of cases. And we're going to see more of these economic espionage cases where, technology actually does get transferred, again, in some different way, shape, or form, either through some joint venture project, through some company that is trying to buy or license or acquire technology. And an academic might be involved in that, but then maybe some of the technology involves university proprietary information that came from a federal grant. I mean, there's a lot of different scenarios here in which you can get sucked into this vortex of inquiry. But the thing to do, folks, is just you got to accept the fact that if you've got ties with China and you're traveling, not even just to China, but you have research ties to China, or you're researching in a technology that the government somehow thinks the Chinese government covets, whether it's, something in life science or, artificial intelligence, whatever it is, the kind of stuff that both countries are intensely competing over, you're going to be caught up in it. And you might be traveling to France and coming back from, like I said, Israel, but you still could be part of a government inquiry because of this new focus on how to stem the perceived theft of U.S. technology by Chinese sponsored efforts. So it's how much of that is really going on is subject to some conjecture, but the U.S.-China politic right now and the tensions, not, as I've said before, not even with the new administration that came in 2020, or 21 rather, the policies really haven't changed that much. The tensions are high, both politically and economically, and we're caught up in the middle of it all. And
thank you, Brian. And just want to send quick thanks to Greg before he departs. We truly appreciate all of your help from yourselves and Ayla for the community.
Thank you again for having me on. I can stay on for another minute or two if there's a final question in the immigration space, but I'll let Brian kind of finish his remarks. Thank you again for
That's
having me.
right.
It's great to see everybody.
That's all right. I think I made my point.
Thank you, Brian. Greg, just as a last question for you before you depart, just, what are some of the top line resources that you think AILA could offer for those who do need immigration legal assistance in the future? And also, are there limitations based on whether people qualify for pro bono assistance?
So let's see, I'll try to take those in the order you asked. So in terms of just general resources, I think those have all been put into the chat, and I'm sure AASF will send them again. If you need assistance finding a lawyer, AILAlawyer.org is a find a lawyer resource that we provide. We have 16,000 members nationally and 3 international chapters, including one in the Asian Pacific region. So we can certainly help with that. That's probably just an important step to think about, even if you don't do a consultation with a lawyer, to identify a couple that you think you can be in touch with in the future. Secondly, sorry, what was your second question?
Oh, and also just what are some of the limitations in terms of getting pro bono assistance versus just regular assistance from attorneys?
Right. So pro bono assistance is going to be something that's typically law firms or individual immigration lawyers will evaluate on a case-by-case basis for more significant cases that might have, if you really are unable to pay whatsoever, or if there might be, let's say, a discriminatory basis. There are certain organizations that provide assistance directly for these kinds of situations. The ACLU takes on cases. I don't want to offer Ashley necessarily. I don't know if she handles those cases individually. I know she does some cases, but there are going to be a number of organizations that could take cases on a pro bono basis, asking for that assistance from AASF or AILA. We can try to direct you in that area, but it's going to be generally on a needs basis for pro bono assistance.
Thank you so much, Greg. We truly appreciate your expertise today.
Great to see all of you. Thank you so much for having me on.
One thing I might add, Gisela, from AASF is making efforts and has made efforts to create a referral network of lawyers along with AAJ and some other groups, so that professors, academics, anybody can call and ask some basic questions and do that sort of consultation for free. So we are working to try to do that. And then I encourage academics in particular, those of you who are employees of research institutions in the US that receive federally funded grants related to some of these fields that are under scrutiny, to talk to the in-house lawyers at your university. Whereas before there was clearly a divide between the universities and the professors, I sense that there has been a narrowing of that gulf, that the university in-house lawyers, while they may be looking after the university's interests, see now more and more the common alignment and may be willing to help you, may be willing to give their cell phone numbers or make a referral to someone, as a recent institution did with me. They had a professor who was going to do a external joint venture, some kind of consultancy or something with an external entity. He went to that university to disclose it, but he wanted to get some advice about how he could make sure he wouldn't run afoul of federal regulations or university policies. And while they gave him some information, they gave him my name as someone who he could talk to. They wouldn't pay for it, but at least give him the guidance he needed before he jumped in with this organization that was doing this research that they wanted the benefit of his talents and was willing to give him some interest in this company. So that goes back to what Ashley and Greg were saying before. Get the legal advice, and if you can get it from your employer and let them know you're traveling to China and blah, 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 and give them some idea of what your itinerary is and all that stuff, even if it isn't having anything to do with a research project that's funded, either by a Chinese institution or your employer, disclose it and coordinate with them and get some advice from them and maybe get their phone numbers if you're stopped. So you can say, look, I just got back from China. I was on a university trip or I wasn't, and get some help that way.
Thank you so much, Brian. And to address folks' questions, certainly based on the comfort levels of the panelists, we're happy to provide their contact information and also email you all some of the resources that were shared earlier that you may have missed. I also did want to share that, yes, Asian American Scholar Forum will be launching our Legal Defense and Education Fund to provide more opportunities for you all, such as our Know Your Rights webinar series. Make sure you have access to legal counsel and opportunities for greater education. And of course, working with our partners and colleagues at Advancing Justice AJC under Legal Referral Service, at ALA for their vast network of immigration attorneys. There is a whole community here that seeks to support you all and the needs that we have. I did want to turn back to Brian and Ashley when it comes to electronics, because this is a question that keeps popping up for folks, because academics do often have to travel for work. They do have to bring their laptops to conduct their work. What can make it a little easier for them and safer as they travel? Should they be getting letters from their employers? Is that letter sufficient, or could they potentially still get in trouble even if they're officially going out and traveling for work?
You want to go first, Ashley?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think the general advice that I provided at the outset is definitely still applicable here. And it's going to depend on your legal status in the country. But if you're a US citizen or an LPR and your identity has been verified, your status has been verified, you have the right to refuse to provide the login and password. But if you exercise that right, it is possible that the device will be seized. It is possible that you'll be subject to additional delays. And if the device is seized, it's unclear exactly when you'll get it back. I think, ideally you can coordinate with the university beforehand to get a separate device for traveling where you're keeping the bare minimum of information on it. And then when you pass through customs, make sure that it's locked, it's password protected, you have it in airplane mode. Those are really the best things you can do. Log out of your social media and email accounts before you proceed. In terms of a letter from the employer, I guess it depends on the precise circumstances, but it's hard to see how that might make a difference. I don't know, Brian might have more thoughts about that.
Well, I was just thinking about the scenario where you say to the CBP agent, I can't give you the password without talking to my employer. And see how they react to that. Because, that might just mean, okay, we're just going to take this thing till you go and get that password and that approval. So, because if they want this stuff, they're going to take it and they're going to want to search it. And if it's the university says, no, we're not going to authorize Mr. or Ms. X to give you the password, let them have that fight. But as Ashley said, you do that, you may be there all night. And then it'll be a big mess. But, a letter can't hurt, but still the prudent course is less is more. Don't take a lot of stuff unless you need to take it. And if you can get a university laptop, it's relatively clean and you can load on it what you need, that's probably a better do than a don't. Devices are such that they're very interested in your phones. And those of you who like to do the WeChat, WhatsApp stuff, keep in mind, that's the kind of stuff they're really looking for. Or Gmail, personal Gmail accounts. They love that. And people say stupid, goofy things on those accounts. So that's another thing I like to say. Don't say stupid, goofy things if you can avoid it.
And
I agree. I endorse that recommendation.
You'd be amazed at what people write in their WeChat, WhatsApps, and Gmails.
One
And-
other thing I would just flag, oh, sorry, Gisela, go ahead.
Oh, no, go on. And well, I'll pose this question, Ashley. This is a common issue we often have, which is what's the difference between WeChat as opposed to, let's say, Signal? If you all could actually explain why that makes such a difference.
Sure, I'm less familiar with WeChat's capabilities, but my understanding is that it's not end-to-end encrypted in the way that Signal is. So Signal is what's called end-to-end encrypted, which means that even if the government goes to Signal and says, Signal, we want the contents of the messages from Ashley Gorski, we've got a court order, we want them now. Signal can't give the government that information. From Signal's perspective, it's gobbledygook. It's incomprehensible. They can't make sense of it. It's all encrypted. And so now with I don't know enough about WeChat to really represent, but with other messaging services, they will be encrypted while in transit, which means the US government cannot readily decipher the message while it is being sent from point A to point B. But if the US government goes to the company that provides the service and says, I've got a warrant or I've got a foreign intelligence surveillance order, I want all the content that's being sent to or from Ashley Gorski, that company can see the content and can provide the government with the content. So using end-to-end encryption provides a much higher level of protection for your messages.
That's pretty much my understanding too. Signal is a higher form of maybe giving you some protection or security from government intrusion, but there are some of my spook friends will tell me there's even different levels of Signal that make it even hard for the spooks to get through it. And so WeChat, on the other hand, it's a very popular way to do business, particularly for people of Chinese descent or Chinese like to use it. And the government is hip to the fact that some of the best stuff that they're looking for can be found there and not on a business email account. So they're all over that, and they're very keenly interested in the phones and the stuff they can get off the devices from that source.
And then there's two questions. One, I think, on level of intensity, and I think the second more on data. On the level of intensity, let's say someone tries to follow all of this advice to the T. They don't bring, they bring a blank phone, they bring a clear laptop. Could they actually be asked to still sign on, download the app if they haven't fully gotten rid of it and they still have a login and password somewhere at home? So for example, they don't have the phone with all their apps, but they still actually do have their Facebooks, their Instagrams. They just need to log in.
They can certainly be asked if you're present with the device to open up the stuff so they can take a look. I mean, that's been my experience, and they'll ask you if you do it. They'll do it, and most people do if they're asked to just say, we want to take a look. But I mean, you can refuse, and then it goes back to what Ashley was saying. That just opens up another can of worms. And because they may just take the device, and if they've got enough stuff from other sources, they just may get a search warrant, or they may seize it, and which is a big pain. But Ashley, I don't know if you have a different view on that, or.
No,
And just to clarify, Ashley, it's if they don't have any apps on their phone for travel, but they actually still regularly use these apps, does it make a difference?
yeah, if they don't have the apps on their phone for travel, the CBP officer can only access what is on the device itself
Right.
under CBP policy.
Right.
Those officers are not allowed to access the cloud under their own policy. So that would mean that those accounts are not visible to the officers, and the officers do not have access to them if they are not actually on, if the app is not on the device.
And how common, I think someone here had a question of what are the odds of getting any form of secondary inspection? is there any way to really know how often this is happening? And what are some ways that some organizations have gone about trying to get this data?
Well, look, once you've been flagged, doesn't mean they'll hit you every time you come in, but sometimes some people are flagged with the idea they're going to hit them every time. I mean, the one I like to tell is about that. What's that band called? Guns N' Roses. They once trashed something at an airport, so every single member was put in the system, and for every member for the next 20 years, they were flagged coming into the country. And one of the guys asked me to go and try to get him off being flagged, so he wouldn't have to go to secondary every time he came into the country. And I can tell you, it was almost like requiring an executive order of the president to get that from CBP. So once you've been flagged, it can be hard. I've heard now instances of people losing their global entry status because they've been flagged or identified in some inquiry, which is sort of chicken. Well, I got to watch my language here, but it's really offensive that you would have your global entry status taken away from you and not have, I guess, whatever they call global entry, not a preferred status, but someone who's trusted. That's the word, a trusted member. And that's offensive to say you're no longer trusted because you've been flagged by some NSF person who's looking at a grant that you worked on. But that's the level that you're dealing with now. There's not much you can do about it. You can make a record, you can ask, but my experience so far, it's been getting lost in the bureaucracy to try to seek redress.
And I think another question is, if your devices are taken while you're being searched, how long can they hold on to it?
Yeah, so under their policy, there are different limits, but they're really not supposed to hold on to it for more than a month unless they're like extenuating circumstances. But for some of our clients, the devices have been held for months. Again, for others, they've been held for a matter of days. So you're rolling the dice with it. It's difficult to know. If your device is being held for an unusually long period of time, you can, if you have the means or if you're eligible for pro bono legal assistance, you can pursue legal assistance and file a claim in court for the return of property.
Yeah, you can file a motion for return of property.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to go to that expense or make a record about it, to flush the government out. And particularly in criminal cases, in civil forfeiture cases, we do that to flush the government out sometimes. The converse of that is it forces the government to take some kind of action as to your client when you do that, because they want to keep the property. But, then you got in issues of, okay, you want to get a phone return, but then they want to keep a copy of everything that was on the phone. And those issues.
Now, being stopped at a port of entry can be very intimidating. And so I think one of the questions that was posed is, if you do want to ask for an attorney before answering certain questions about your background, your family history, how do you go about this in a way that neutralizes the situation or de-escalates the interaction?
I'm happy to start. I think Greg had some really great recommendations earlier in the presentation to make a request firmly, but you don't want to escalate. So a firm request, a confident request, but without getting agitated, without resisting. All of that said, CBP, as a matter of policy, does not allow attorneys to interact with clients while they're in secondary, as a general rule. However, if you're asking to make contact with the attorney, you may be able to make that phone call, which can bring you peace of mind, and I think can also shorten the duration of the questioning, because CBP is aware that an attorney is watching and that this interaction is going to be subject to some scrutiny.
Right, and just I do get these calls, usually when they're on the way to secondary, or the CBP officer in his or her infinite kindness, whatever, will allow them to make the phone call. So it isn't just a text, it's a phone call where you can have some conversation with your client before they go into secondary and all that stuff. But going to your point, Gisela, the psychological and the emotional aspects of this, vary with the individual. All we can counsel folks on is, try to be yourself. Don't over talk. Okay. Tell the truth when asked, or, if you're uncomfortable answering the question, or you think if the answer is not a yes or no, and you think you're being set up, say, look, I just think I would want to talk to my lawyer about this before I answer it. I think I can, but I'd like to talk to the lawyer. I mean, if it's a particularly sensitive question. And all you can do is try to be as calm as you can in a difficult situation. But know that you're going to get through it, because you will. But as Ashley said, the more you do that can stretch the thing out, that could be a problem. So you got to strike a balance. But usually if you come across as being cooperative and conveying that you are just, like any other person coming back in the country, and they've taken you aside and you're not happy about it because you want to get home, but and that's the other aspect I have found. People coming back from long trips that are stopped and sent to secondary, you're tired, you're not happy about this, and this guy or person is asking a bunch of questions that could be important to your employment and your future. It's one of those things where you gotta be vigilant. You can't just sort of say it's nothing. You got to be serious about it. I mean, I have this mantra in all my talks about don't be stupid. Okay, that's a weird way of saying things, but I always say just don't be stupid and cute and all that kind of stuff, because that'll backfire on you. Okay.
Thank you, Brian, for a very empathetic and human response to that question. I think another question folks have is, in terms of all of the data, answers and responses that they receive, how much of that could potentially be used against you in the future if you do have a criminal investigation? And also, what is the extent of collaboration between CBP and the FBI? And lastly, just because I know we're a bit short on time, I wanted to also clump this question, which I think was inspired by your initial discussion, Brian, which is, what are the research areas that people should be mindful of that puts them potentially in some sort of watch list for CBP or the FBI?
Well, those are three areas. I'll try to hit them quick and then turn it back over to Ashley. First of all, the question about answering the how to answer the questions or something like that. You definitely have to, like any other thing, these questions and how you answer them can be used against you in a subsequent criminal inquiry, and that's where mostly it might be used. I doubt in the administrative civil context of whether or not you've properly disclosed conflict of interest issues and all that, maybe less so. But in a criminal context, it is a felony to make a false statement to a government agent or employee, like a CBP officer. So it is something that could come back to bite you. Number two, the CBP probably is cooperating to the extent that if an FBI agent requests CBP to flag somebody and maybe ask them questions when they come in from a country, there is that collaboration. Okay, it exists. And it may not even be the FBI, maybe some other agency involved from a law enforcement standpoint. And then what was the third one? It was
a question on sort of what are your research areas that could potentially
Oh, yeah.
put you in a watch list?
Well, I said bio-life sciences, everything. I mean, look, we've had cases involving everything from medical imaging devices to cures for cancer to microprocessing chips and drug biopharma drug research type stuff. It runs the gamut. Okay, so it's in many respects, it is economic espionage type of stuff that the government is looking at, corporate economic espionage, but it's also just cutting edge research on anything that they think could give one country some edge or supremacy over the other as the technology rivalry or competition between the country continues. When you're talking about areas that involve a military use, that's even a higher level of scrutiny. But if someone's doing research on Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's or something like that, they'll still look at it. And so none of that's immune from my stand, because we've seen it. We've seen it. Anybody who's getting a federal grant to do research on something that's cutting edge, that's game. That's for them, I think.
So very quickly, in response to the question about the university employer letter, I think I mentioned that, you know, as a traveler, you can decline to give CBP your password. And I just want to underscore again that that advice applies to individuals who are US citizens and LPRs, and that if you are not in those categories, if you decline to provide a password or decline to answer questions, you can be denied entry into the United States. So again, overarching theme here that the rules are really different depending on your legal status. And Gisela, to your question, just wanted to underscore that the answers that you provide during secondary inspection are entered into a database called TEX, where they remain for up to 75 years and are accessible to thousands of federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies around the country. If your device is forensically searched and copied, that copy will be available to thousands of individuals within DHS for up to 15 years. So you know, the data will be there for a long time, and like Brian's saying, it can be used for a variety of purposes.
Thank you, Ashley and Brian. And I just wanted to get to the last two questions. Would you both have capacity to stay 10 minutes over? One of the questions are just, what are the common questions that people should expect for these inspections, and what are some of the flags that may lead to secondary?
Well, I'll start. Look, if you've been flagged, the first part of the questions might be just to confirming your identity, who you are, where you were traveling from. A lot of the same kind of questions you get from a customs officer when you come back in the country. Where'd you come from? Came from Mexico. I was there on vacation. I moved family, whatever, visiting family. You might get those preliminary questions. And then the more material or the harder stuff will come as they're walking you down and saying, well, look, we have some further inquiries we want to make with you. And please come this way. You know, secondary for most people is when you come in, they ask you this, I came from Mexico and all that. All right, go to secondary because we want to see what you brought back into the country. They look through your stuff. Here, the focus is not just looking at your stuff, what devices, but they want to know what you did, who you saw there, that kind of stuff. And so this thing can get into a pretty detailed back and forth about sort of who you are, what you do, why were you traveling there, who did you see, and get a little bit into what you do for a living, like as if they're just sort of an interested person in your background. That's how the CBP guys might come across. Now, some of them have been prepped more fully than others about the nature of why you're being referred to secondary. So like they may already know that there's some issue involving you having some collaboration with some university in Wuhan over something or another. Or you, even if you're coming back from France on vacation, they may want to know, were you at some international conference? Did you see people from other countries? What did you do? What did you say? What did you exchange? Whatever. I mean, they'll get into that because that's, you know, the little blurb that they've gotten about you will give them enough to go on so that they just sort of do a little interview of you. And then in some instances, you might even hit on directly the grant or the project that may be at issue. And so it varies, but a lot of it is to just get what you did on your trip, who you saw, and what your devices will reveal. And if your devices reveal that you've carried away some proprietary technology with you while you were in China, they'll want to know about it. And who had access to it? Did you leave your laptop in your room? You know, all that kind of stuff that relates to this concern that somehow someone might get access to something they shouldn't. But it can be, I have a case I'm doing now involving a non-academic, but who used to be an academic, who was charged and convicted of allegedly possessing or stealing with the intent to profit. The formula for how Coca-Cola does the lid on their cans, their aluminum cans, and how they, I mean, you know, it's as crazy as stuff like that. Wasn't even the formula for Coca-Cola. It was for how they put it in their aluminum cans. You know, this is the kind of stuff that you ask yourself, how is this going to threaten US national security if a Chinese company gets a hold of that? Well, I don't know. Maybe there's some unknown military use for that, but the bottom line is it can be anything that has a commercial value. And a Chinese company or institution is interested in it. That's sad to say, but that's the state of the world we're in.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. And for our last question of the night, and this one pertains to not just the academics, but their families, friends, and even regular folks, you know, Chinese Americans and others who have natural ties to China, family members, things that are part of their identity that they can't control. Lifting up what you had mentioned earlier, Brian, on just any collaborations or connections to China, what can these folks do when they're asked less about work and more about familial ties? And sort of what are some of their avenues moving forward? How can they tackle some of these questions? And is this something that they should expect long-term?
Well, they certainly should expect those kind of questions if they're coming back from China. The government takes the view that even loyal citizens can be subverted or co-opted by the evil MSS or somebody to give information because they might be threatened or extorted because of loved ones in China. All right. And so that's a common theme with the FBI, the concern that people who hold very important positions where they have knowledge of sensitive stuff could be taken advantage of that way by foreign intelligence sources. And so, you know, that's how they bring in the families. And there is this thing, not directly connected to this, but there is this thing that the Department of Justice calls Operation Fox Hunt, where they say the Chinese government has sent a bunch of operatives over here. Sometimes they call it local Chinese police stations, but they go out and harass Chinese nationals or immigrants to try to get stuff and use the threat of intimidation on their families in China or on them to get information that would benefit the Chinese government. And that's in the news. There were some recent indictments on that and in Brooklyn. And that's a real concern, but that shows you that familial ties with China makes you also another person that could be put on the list of people who they think, may not necessarily be giving anything to China, but could be co-opted by Chinese authorities on one of your trips back. At least that's the perception of some of the counterintelligence folks.
Thank you, Brian. And Ashley, did you have any last thoughts on that?
Just that, it's difficult to predict whether the questioning will be recurrent. And I know after an experience like that, it can be traumatic. Officers are carrying guns. Sometimes you're being questioned in a windowless room. It's extremely unpleasant and extremely stressful. And I think there's a natural tendency to be concerned that it will happen again. And while it may happen again, that's not necessarily the case. So I think it's important to follow our advice here tonight, and if necessary, consult with a lawyer. And I hope everyone has safe and easy travels going forward.
Amen.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Brian. We have benefited so much from your expertise. If we had known that some of this border harassment and enforcement issues were going to happen, we certainly would have done this before the holidays. But thank you all so much. Thank you to all of our panelists. I hope that you felt heard and that we lifted up as much of your questions as we could as possible. Feel free to join our mailing list, and we're happy to reach out again to all of the registrants who need or are asking for our contact information for our panelists. Once again, it'll depend on their own comfort levels, but we're happy to share back any resources. Otherwise, I'll pass on to Professor Xiaodong Zhang to close us out tonight.
Yeah. Thank you for all the participants in this webinar. And at the peak time, we'll have about 300 participants. And also you raised many excellent questions. Thank you, Ashley, for presenting the rights for US citizens who are entering the border and the rules to follow. Greg has left. Thank you, Greg, for explaining the rules for immigrants and green card holders to enter the border. Thank you, Brian, for giving your insights, lots of insights, into the government inspections and scrutiny to university research activities. Lots of new information. Thank you all the panelists to answer many questions. I followed the chat. I think almost all the questions have been answered by the panelists. Gisela, finally, thank you for monitoring the panel presentation and discussions. The recorded webinar will be on YouTube for continued access by the public. Thank you again for the participation. We hope to see you in the next AASF webinar. Good night and bye-bye.
Right.